Hello, everybody. Welcome. Happy Valentine's Day. It's me, Amber Beck. How's everybody doing tonight? Tonight I am taking a risk. I am getting on YouTube and TikTok live. I've never done that as far as besides with other people with me. And this will be the first time that I've done this. I want to talk about the Rock Springs, Wyoming Chinese massacre. It's not a very well-touched subject, and I think it needs more information. I think more people need to hear about it because it's such a significant situation. I wanted to start with this a letter out of a California journal. I've lost my place. That's not fun to get started that way. How embarrassing. I'll get better. Okay. So, in the Marin, California Journal of March 30th, 1876, which said about Chinamen that he is a slave reduced to the lowest terms of beggarly economy and is no fit competition for an American freeman, that he herds in scores in small dens where a white man and wife could hardly breathe and has none of the wants of a civilized white man, that he has neither wife nor child nor expects to have any, that his sister is a prostitute from instinct, religion, education, and interest, and degrading to all around her, that American men, women, and children cannot be what free people should be and compete with such degraded creatures in the labor market, that wherever they are numerous, as in San Francisco, by a secret machinery of their own, they defy the law, keep up the manners and customs of China, and utterly disregard all the laws of health, decency, and morality, that they are driving the white population from the state, reducing laboring men to despair, laboring women to prostitution, and boys and girls to hoodlums and convicts, that the health, wealth, prosperity, and happiness of our state demand their expulsion from our shores. I hate that that's how they viewed the Chinese back then. The war started, or the riot happened in 1885. I've lived here in Rock Springs 2 separate times since 2020. And I felt a little bit uneasy in 2020, and then when I came back again in 2021. Things happened because of COVID. I didn't feel a major sensation of uneasiness as strongly as I do now, but I have always felt a sensation of uneasiness here. And I've been coming here since before my last 2 daughters, Sherry Ann and Riley, were born, and Sherry Ann is 14 and a half now. So, for 14 and a half years, I've been coming up to Rock Springs, and there's just this unsettled vibe, and it's really uncomfortable. It's something you can overlook or, not pay too much attention to, but when you do, it just feels uneasy, and it feels like it's resonating from the ground up. And I didn't really know anything about the Chinese massacre. I'd gone to the Goodwill and there was a lot of China there. And I thought, man, that's a lot of China for, what I assumed to be a cowboy state. I didn't realize that so much history had been involved already. And so back in 1876, the white miners here in Rock Springs were their money that they were making for their work was dropped 20% because Pennsylvania went on strike. And somehow they're affiliated. I don't know how, but they are. And because they went on strike, the miners got penalized here as well as the miners out there got penalized. And so their amounts were dropped from $1.25 for a ton of coal to $1 per ton. Or if you measured by the bushel, it was 5 cents a bushel down to 4 cents a bushel. And that was really extreme for them. It wasn't fair, for sure. That wasn't fair. However, in the economy around us in Cheyenne and all these other places that mining was happening in Union Pacific, it was actually a very fair wage. But because they had already started at a certain wage and then been dropped down, it just felt really, really unfair. So they assumed that the mercantile company that, I think I'm saying that wrong, mercantile, MERC. So however you say that, you know how if it's MER, tell me CH or C or S if it's supposed to sound like mercantile or mercantile. I don't say that word very much. But they were hoping that the cost of all of their essentials from the store was going to come down, because just to kind of make up for that, since it wasn't their fault that they got penalized for. I'm freezing up because this is my first time going live here where it's just me and the camera and it feels a little bit frightening. So I'm not freezing up, but like my word recall isn't as happening as fast as I'd like it to. But so they waited all summer for the merchandise company to make the amenities and everything come down, but it never did. And since that happened that way, by the end of summer, they went on strike and walked off the jobs. They weren't really, they needed the jobs. There wasn't a lot of other places for them to go. That was pretty much the only work around here. There was only like 500 people living in Rock Springs at the time. So it's not like it was a flourishing company with a lot of job opportunity. It wasn't like that. They needed to keep their jobs. What also had happened was that, oh man, I got this wrong. I'm sorry. They didn't walk off their jobs yet until winter time had come. And the coal company had asked that they up their workload because winter was coming and they needed more coal to be able to get through the winter for all of the different places that the coal was going to be allocated. In order to get through that winter, they needed to up their workload. And they demanded that they get back to that $1.25. If they were going to do that, they needed to pay them more. And because they weren't really willing to do that, and then with the strike and everything, they just kept getting all these blows that made them really, I don't know, just not wanting to work. At the time that, at the time that they wanted their work to load up, like to increase their workload. Oh my gosh, I'm having such a hard time here. How's everybody doing? I need a second because I'm nervous. I can't believe this is happening, but that's crazy, huh? Look at my cheeks, they're all turning red and everything. I'm trying to remember how this goes, and I've been studying it a lot lately, and I didn't want to look at the books, but the books would be more effective. Okay. So they didn't get their way, and because they walked off the job, they hired on the Chinese immigrants. And like a couple weeks later, after they had walked off the jobs, because they weren't getting that deduced price for their amenities and things that they needed, their necessities for living, to make up for their wage cut, they walked off 2 weeks later, 2 trains full of 150 immigrants, and what are they called? Carpenters and construction works and supplies came along on this train, and they were there to show the white miners that it didn't matter if they went on strike, that the business was going to keep going, that coal was still going to be harbored or taken out of the mountains and stuff. The job was going to keep going. This made the white miners really, really angry, even more angry. They were already, there was already a lot of time where Chinese were already working for half of the price. They were working for half of what they were working for. So to have these guys come in who were these Chinese immigrants who were not complaining, they were easy to please practically. They just came, would get their jobs done. They didn't need any, like, they didn't need to live by the nice means, you know, they were humble, and some of them didn't even want to use the company's housing. So the supplies came with the carpenters so that they can make houses for these immigrants that were coming onto the train with them. But some of them decided to create dugouts instead. That might have been more effective or efficient in some ways, because it's really, really windy out here, and it gets really, really cold, and it's really uncomfortable outside. And so if you don't have a well-made house, then, you know, you'd stay cold. Like, lots of, if you don't have a house that's built really strong, like made of cement, and, you know, able to withstand the wind that comes through. So it might have been better that they had homes in the dugouts. They didn't really need a lot, and since they were humble and the companies were invested in their Chinese workers, so whenever there was an altercation or any kind of, if they were being bullied, all they had to do was talk to the leaders of the company, the bossmen in the company, and they'd have them they'd have them supported. So it was just creating an intense situation between the white miners and the Chinese. They were very jealous. The white miners were really jealous. And it kind of reminds me of the story of Cain and Abel, where they both had their lots, but Cain's was producing vegetables and Abel's was sacrificing animals, and that seemed a little bit more, well, even like it with the priesthood, the way it was out there and stuff, you know, that was the more higher privilege of sacrifice, or privilege of showing, you know, dedication to God and stuff. So it kind of reminds me of that story, because here they have two lots, and one is not happy with what they have while the other has less, and they still find ways to be happy. And they aren't going out and splurging and being lascivious, and they're not out, you know, they're just being humble and living within their means or less than their means, because their intention all along, before they even got to Wyoming, was that they were going to go back to China. It wasn't permitted to leave China and become naturalized somewhere else. It was illegal. The dynasties didn't like that. They wouldn't allow it. They wouldn't approve. And it was considered a really big, it was so disloyal to leave, even though there's been several times where China has been overpopulated. And there's good cause to leave, but if they left, it was looked down on so much. So here they are taking this risk, because these are, you know, they're not super poor, because it costed money to contract with these companies to have them be immigrated here. It costed money, so they would have to invest in the plan. But they always planned to come back. So when they came back, a lot of the cultures that are here in Rock Springs, they were like, they're non-compliant, they're not trying to be Americanized, they're still acting very Chinese, they're still doing their rituals, they're still smoking opium, they're still, you know, wearing the clothes, or building joss houses, and And they felt like that those were acts of, not being willing to cooperate as an American. But a lot of these other miners were not, they were also immigrants, and they weren't naturalized. They hadn't become citizens, and some of them hadn't even started the process. They hadn't even thought about it. They probably came here hoping to make money, got caught up in the making the money, and had families, and just caught up. You know how it is when you have a family, and day in day out, paycheck to paycheck comes, and life happens, and the money goes, and it's just you have to stay there. It's just a perpetual cycle. And I think that's probably what happened. They didn't even really think about, most of them weren't planning to go back. They were here to stay. So that is different than what the Chinese were doing here. The Chinese had it in the intention of their lives was to come here, make enough money for a set of so many years, and then go back and have something to live off of comfortably for the rest of their lives, and even possibly give their children an inheritance, which I think is a pretty big trade, because their plan had to be a decade or 2 decades, so they're missing out on the upbringing of their kids while they're here working, saving up that money. But in the long run, it's also likely to be for their inheritance. So it's not that they didn't love them, but another thing was they didn't eat like the miners did. I'm sure the miners would go and have, go to the stores and pick out the foods that they wanted. They would have nice meals at the table with their families. And the Chinese, they liked fish. And so they'd have fish imported from San Francisco. And somehow it must have been a cheaper plan, maybe because they got a lot of fish and they knew how to keep it preserved for quite some time, so they didn't have to eat up all of their amenities and food and everything that they had all in once. They were smart. They did things right. And that probably made these people even more mad, because yes, the Chinese did bring in opium. They did smoke it, and it caused them to feel peaceful or calmed their nerves. But these men, the white miners, they were drinking. They had lots of pubs. They had lots of saloons, lots of call girls. So, and maybe that was part of their jealousy too, was that maybe they could sense the morality of the Chinese, that, that they weren't indulging in all of this big lifeness. They were meek and just staying in and just not being, lascivious. They weren't being greedy. They weren't being gluttonous, And maybe that bothered them, because they were going out and drinking and probably spending a lot of what they made on alcohol. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Just, I came on here because I was wondering if you might have any questions that I might be able to answer. I feel a little nervous to be on here, honestly, but I'm feeling a little better now that I've been on here for a few minutes. Almost 20 minutes. That's good. So these people were middle class. There was 6 different harbors in China that was bringing out these immigrants to America. At some point, there were 300,000 immigrants. But sometimes the contracts would not allow you to choose who your employer was going to be. So when women did it, a lot of times they were employed by brothels, and they were employed as prostitutes. And a lot of misunderstanding is that these women came here and chose to do that. It's hard for me to think, though, that, because they had been migrating here since the 40s, since the gold rush, right? and helping since then. So here we are, close to like in 1885, and you know, how many years went by and nobody told them that they didn't get to choose and that they were likely to be put into a brothel. Like, it's hard to think that they didn't have a clue. And maybe the first few years of women who came out may have gone through that without beforehand knowing. But you would think that if they're going to make that decision, they would investigate the decision to go across seas, what it would be like, you know. They could have been innocent. I'm not trying to judge. It's hard to think that decades would have gone by and there was no hear tell of that this might be the case, that this might happen. I think that they would have possibly known. Possibly. So, September 1st came around, and this had built up since 76, when the Chinese men came, and it was 150, and then since then it was about 600. So 10 years, about 600 Chinese men living here in Rock Springs. And they were getting precedence, and they could tell the bosses on the white guys for being bullies and stuff, you know, kind of how it is in schools when somebody's being a bully. And you tell the teacher, that's only going to cause, a lot of times, it's not safe to tell a teacher. It just creates a retaliation back on the ones who are telling. So all it did was increase the harboring of bad feelings towards them. So 10 years later, there was this miscommunication, and there were men missing work, boss men missing work. So one day, the boss man at mine number 6 told the Chinese men that they can have these specific rooms, and then told these 2 white men to pick other rooms that were marked. And the way that it was said was in a way that they assumed it meant to pick a room that the Chinese were not in at that time, not necessarily the rooms that had already been delegated. So it's kind of hard to understand exactly how that played out. So one day, the white men went into the one room that happened to be given to a Chinese man who was missing that day. He didn't show up for work. He might have been sick or something. I'm not sure. So they chose his room. These 2 white men chose his room, and they started putting the charges in. And they quit for the day after putting the charges in, and they went home and decided to come back the next morning to finish the job. And when they came back the next morning, they found a Chinese guy, one of the Chinese men, inside of that marked room that the second guy who took it over thinking it didn't belong to anybody, had already set up. So they had already set off the charges, and the Chinese men were picking up the coal and making money. They were putting it into the cart, and they were, you know, filling up their ton cart. And the 2 men yelled at the Chinese men, told them to get out. And the Chinese men refused because that was their room for 2 days. It's been their room. And it wasn't their fault that those guys misunderstood, but those men started creating an altercation. They started creating a fight, insults, and weapons were grabbed on both parties. Weapons were grabbed, and they started fighting, and men from other marked rooms came in to assist and aid or to help break up. And then the boss man came in and broke it up, but not before 2 of them were so injured and brutally beaten that they were sent home on what, I don't remember what it's called, but it sounded like a straight board to keep their bodies immobilized. And one of them did later die from the injuries of the fighting. that chaos and all that commotion created the men who were in that marked room to come together as a mob. But before that happened, the night before, they had a meeting in the Knights of Labor Community Hall. And they, through those years, those 10 years, they were riling themselves up in more and more anger and more contention and jealousy against these Chinese men. And so that night, they were kind of already creating a plan. But even before that night, some of the accounts that I've read about talked about a week prior, a man who was meeting another man from not even being in Rock Springs, has nothing to do with the coal mines, had something to do with traveling or a place to stay. He told the guys that there was a to-do that was about to happen in a week. He was going to come back in a week and there was going to be a to-do, but he didn't let on to what he meant by that. And the men felt a little bit puzzled, like, what do you mean? But they didn't ask questions, or maybe they did and he just didn't give them the answers. And so there was already something kind of stirring. So when the mob came together, they delegated 3 men, a committee of 3 men, to go into Chinatown and to warn the Chinese men to pack up their stuff and leave, because in 1 hour they were going to be there. And they had their weapons and they were on their way, and they split into groups. Excuse me. One of the groups went up through Pilot Butte. Another group went through a Stagecoach Drive. And I can't remember which other street they came through, but they were trying to just kind of like get them to squeeze them out. So they were warned, but they were scared that the Chinese men were going to retaliate and have arms against them. So instead of giving them that hour ultimatum, they broke it in about 30 minutes. They showed up in 30 minutes and then they started shooting into the air to encourage a more rapid result of them leaving. They had had enough. The 2 sides that were together. So they formed into 3 groups. The 2 were closer together, but one was coming through the back. The 2 sides that were forming together, they were shooting in the air. But the one that came in through the back started shooting into the space where the men would stand, where their bodies would be killed, and had killed some within their shots. And so because of that, it gave them courage it gave those 2 groups in the front to start shooting lower too. And they did kill a lot. So altogether there were 28 Chinese men who were murdered. They went through, and with all the housing, there were over 78 houses that were built for the Chinamen who came to work for the companies. They had started putting these houses to fire. Hello, Betty. How's it going? And they would go into the basements of these houses to make sure that none of the Chinese men were down there hiding. But they didn't see all the Chinese men, because as they burnt the houses, they looted. They, got their stuff. They burnt the houses. And they didn't get them all out, because the next morning there were charred men. Altogether, they said there was about 7 to 8 men who were burnt to death. And that when they came the next morning, that there were pigs that were eating one of the charred Chinese men's body. The saddest part was when the mobs gathered. To me, I feel like the saddest part was when the mobs gathered. They gathered their wives and children too. all this time, their anger didn't just stay within them, but it had also like spilled over into their families. And their families had as much hatred for the Chinese men as the miners. And it makes me really sad. At some point, I feel like some people were trying to conceal one of the women's name who shot two Chinese men. They were trying to keep her name concealed. But what had happened was that after a lot of things had happened, after the biggest part of the riot had happened, she had gone around bragging about killing two Chinese men. And so it happened to mention in this book, and none of the other books that I've read didn't mention any of the women's name. They did say they had women shooting, but this one gave a name of Mrs. Osborne. And I'm just kind of feeling like, couldn't she have done more to help too? Like, what if they didn't go out and splurge and drink alcohol on a regular basis? And what if she gained a green thumb? And what if she, did things to help make the food stretch more if it was a matter of food? Or, could she have done more than just turn her husband's anger? Hi, Brenda. Hi, Patricia. Instead of using their husband's anger, instead of harboring it themselves, but maybe getting better than that, being better than that, maybe even offering consolation to their spouses while they were angry about all that had happened. But they didn't. It seems that they saw eye to eye with them and stood with the same Chinese must go stance. Some of the men ran into the hills and were never seen again. A group of 3 men ran into the hills, and one of the men came back 4 days later. He had been thirsty, he was hungry, frozen, and crazed. He said that his 2 other guys that he had with him had been eaten by wolves, which might have made him stir crazy. It would make me that way too, because if in through the nights, 4 days and nights out into this wilderness of scary rocks, darkness, animals, wind, cold, and then seeing right before your eyes your comrades being killed viciously by wild animals. That's probably why he dared to come back, probably, I would think. Or I wouldn't have come back, but under those circumstances, I might have. Hey there, how's it going? Hey, Miguel. So, the Union Pacific had heard what was going on, and so they took a train and started having it rolling slowly to Evanston. Evanston's about 100 miles south of here, going towards Utah. It's on the border of Utah. And the train was going slowly to take these men to Evanston because there was a Chinese community there and a Joss house there. And so they wanted to bring them together where it felt like it was going to be safe. But the feelings had gone bad there too for their Chinese men. And they also threatened that they would start a riot and they would do the same kind of damage if the Chinese men stayed. If they came, if they stayed, if they weren't gone within 72 hours. So they put them back onto the railroad tracks. They tricked them. They told them they were going to go east towards... Not east. They told them they were going to go west towards San Francisco. And that offered them some relief. By that time, there was about 200 military men who were on the trains with them. And instead of taking them west to San Francisco, they took them to Rock Springs again. They were angry because they tricked them into thinking that they were going to have better circumstances. But they didn't. But 4 cavalry dispatches came out and were sent to be here for a long time to ensure that the riots didn't happen, that their safety was upheld. Is anyone here that's been kind of like listening for a few minutes, like kind of listening to what's been going on? And if you have any thoughts, what do you think about it? What do you think of this? I've been here. This is my 3rd time since 2020, and I've just been feeling uneasy. But as I've gotten older, I feel like I'm a little more sensitive. And so I'm like, if I'm going to live here, I need to know what I'm feeling and meet it with understanding, because I was not meeting it with understanding. I was meeting it with fear. And I was watching something that said, like, do unto others as you'd have others, right? Do to you. And if you're approaching maybe a past spirit, like a spirit that's passed on from here, and you're afraid of it, it's going to mirror what you're doing. I don't know if that's true. I haven't had enough experience with ghosts and stuff. I just know that the air here is heavy. They have so many mines and tunnels under Rock Springs. I saw a map of it and I didn't take a picture of it. I wish I would have, because at any given time there could be a big old hole in the road, because any of that can cave in at some point. They said that there is even a road from Rock Springs that goes maybe even all the way to Reliance, which is where we lived the first time in that high school. Hi, Andrea. Hi, Big Herman and Veradobison. Hi, guys. Just kind of giving an account of the 1885 Chinese massacre of Rock Springs, Wyoming. It's kind of been something I've really taken on an interest to, because I just really want to settle these emotions, square these feelings, not feel like scared, knowing that there's tunnels all over Rock Springs, so at any given time, which is probably why I feel it energetically here more, because it's hollowed out, because there was all that animosity for years under the ground. I think that's probably why it was like that. I know that's kind of a crazy thing to do on Valentine's Day, isn't it? To give an account. I've been looking through books, and there is another book at the library I want to take a look at that talks about each of the members that were here at that time. And I want to see where Mrs. Osborne was from. I want to know more about her. Curious to what kind of person she might have been. My brain is imagining like this mean redhead. I have red hair too, but it's not real. Back then they didn't have the dye as much. Well, they did, but it wasn't accessible like it is here. Any questions? Well, this is my first time being on here. I've been on TikTok lives before, but I'm usually recording a band. And it's a lot easier to have the camera facing away from you and not having to be in front of the camera. But yeah, at first it was really scary and my face was getting all flustered. It still is warm. Did any of you guys have some awesome things you did for Valentine's? Are you out on a date with your loved one? Well, I'm going to end this then, and you guys have a good night. Happy Valentine's. Maybe I'll get back on here just for the sake of visiting instead of trying to tell a story about the massacre. I hope you guys have a good night. All right, take care.